Okay, I think we're at 8:16 and coming up to 8:17. Could I ask everyone just to put their themselves on mute, because there is a bit of background noise, and I think we'll start the session. So welcome. Some of you I know, and for those of you I don't, my name is Charlie Grubb. I work as a Senior Managing Director for the Executive Search Practice of Robert Half. I'm joined by my colleagues, Layla Tyndall and Trevor Dimmock, fellow MDs. And just as a sort of bit of background, we work with fast growth mid-cap businesses to help them build leadership teams at both board and executive level. And over the last 18 months, we've been asked many questions about what the future looks like, what the trends are that we're seeing, the surge in importance of environmental social governance. What does that look like for value creation in the long term? A number of the sort of newer roles that we're seeing and the expertise that's required in board meetings. How do we make sure there is or ensure board effectiveness? Anyway, as the UK and the globe cautiously reduces our restrictions, business demands will continue to accelerate. So today, hello, Greg.
Morning.
So today we're going to look at the future of how this might impact the board, its priorities, and the skills required. So first of all, I'm pleased to introduce our two experts, Dr. Martin Spencer, previously Group HR Director for companies like GoCompare and Zurich, a doctor, psychologist, a coach and mentor to board members. And our second expert, Ian White, experienced legal counsel, company secretary, an expert advisor to boards on boardroom effectiveness. He's worked with organisations such as Admiral Group, Harworth Group, Glass Cymru. So what I'd like to do is, just before I pass over to them, we're going to have they're going to share their views and experiences looking into the future. There will be a Q&A session at the end. So please feel free to put any questions that you think about in the chat, and we will have time at the end for a live Q&A debate. But first of all, I'd like to hand over to our experts. Ian, I think you're first up.
Yeah, are you going to do the poll quickly? Charlie, we're going to have a poll first.
Yes, please. Okay, yeah, fair point, good point. Donna Chen, if you're able to share with the audience a poll. So you should receive a poll. If you could just perhaps spend 30 to 45 seconds on answering that question. Great. If we could start thinking about drawing that poll to a conclusion. Everyone done? Could we close the poll, Donatien, please? So perhaps just to get us started and just to get us thinking, clearly over the next few years, we can absolutely see increased complexity and challenges that are going to be facing board members. Interestingly, there's a small amount, very small amount that sees reduced, but let's have a look as we move into the future, what that increased complexity might look like. So appreciate your time on that. Could we take that poll down, please? And perhaps share the slides now.
Thanks very much, Donatien. Could we the next slide? I feel I'm going to be like Chris Whitty for much of this presentation. So this is what we're going to cover today. As Charlie said, please ask any questions and we'll try and answer those at the end. But looking at what we've entitled this, the board of the future, looking at boardroom effectiveness. People are quite keen, I think, to know what makes an effective meeting, and clearly since the pandemic, the factors of that have changed slightly. So that really comes on to the next point, how technology is impacting board. And then we'll look at drivers of change, and clearly, given that most people think that boards are going to be face more complex challenges over the next few years, that's going to be pretty important. We'll discuss briefly the pandemic and its impact on succession planning, which is something that I always find that boards have challenges with, and is something that I often make as a recommendation in board effectiveness review reports, that they spend more time on. So that's it. Briefly, we'll aim to sort of do about half an hour and then have time for questions at the end. I know everybody wants to obviously get away by about 9:15. Can we have the next slide, please? Well, so what is boardroom effectiveness? I mean, it is very much the board working well together, and we put the word leading the organisation effectively. One of the things that comes up in all boards is the dilemma about how much they focus on strategy and how much they dive more into the detail. It happens constantly, and if you look at this from a theoretical perspective, people say, oh well, the board's there to deal with strategy, and the executive team is there to implement that strategy, but also be operational. I mean, it's a nice theory, but actually in practice, boards on occasion will have to be much more operational to be effective than they normally would be. And a prime example of that is the pandemic. But also, if you've got something like a M&A activity, your board is bound to be more operational. So it's not a clear delineation in being an effective board, but saying the board is strategic and the executive team is operational. One of the challenges, I think, though, is where the boards do, and particularly the non-executives, do tend to strike down into the detail, and it's quite a difficult transition often for people new to NED roles to make that transition across to being much more of in a supervisory challenging role, rather than actually thinking I've got to roll my sleeves up and get on with this, because that's what I did as an executive. So I think the board has definitely got to operate differently depending on the circumstances. And in terms of being effective, there is rightly a focus on having the right skills around the boardroom table, to make sure that you can cover the major areas that any organisation is going to face. You can't have every skill on the board. It just isn't possible unless your board's going to be about 40 or 50 people. So you've obviously got to bear that in mind. But I think, and this is one of the ways that board effectiveness has been going and board reviews have been going over the last 10 years or so, is a real move towards board dynamics and accepting that, yes, the right skills are important, but alone they're not enough, and that you have to have people who can work effectively together. And so certainly when looking at reviews, and Martin, somebody of Martin's background, I think is key to, is looking on how effective people can work together, because the board is a team like any other team in some ways, and therefore people have to be able to work together. So having all the right skills is good, but if you've got people who can't stand working with each other, you'll have a dysfunctional board. So how will a board effectiveness review help? Well, it's worth giving a little bit of a background to this. I'm sure a lot of you know this, but for FTSE 350 companies that are governed by the UK Corporate Governance Code, and in old money that's the Cadbury Code, effectively those companies are going to have to do a board effectiveness review, an external one every 3 years. And if they don't, I'll have to explain why they're not doing that to their shareholders in the report and account. So it's a comply or explain regime. But other companies now are taking it on the mantle of doing that. So, for example, heavily regulated companies, whether they're listed or not, will do that. A lot of financial services companies do it because the regulators like them to do an external review from time to time. and the standard sort of process is that you do an external, as I say, once every 3 years, and then years 1 and 2 in between you would do an internal review. But there might be other reasons you'd want to do a review. For example, you might have a new chair. It will help them. I've just done a review where there's been a change in chair, and one of the requests I was scoping the review was, can you produce something that will be useful for our new chair in their role taking over, so that they know how the board operates. They've got a framework for that. There might be board issues. You might have a new board or a fairly new board. So again, there can be all sorts of reasons. And I say, although this started out really in the listed sector, you'll now get a lot of organisations ranging from public sector to charities and to private companies generally doing these reviews. Just to talk briefly through a typical process, if there is one, what we would normally do is scope the review with the chair and the company secretary, general counsel. And those are typically the parties that are involved. You might have a questionnaire that will be sent out to the board members and the main attendees of board meetings. I would say that's optional, but it's quite a good practice to do. But probably the most important part of any board review is the one-to-one interviews, because they're done on a confidential basis. It's where people can say, what they really think, in a safe environment. I think you have to bear in mind, although it is confidential, because it's a relatively small number of people around the board, it can be quite easy to guess who said what. So when we're writing reports, you have to be quite careful not to necessarily use a turn of phrase that somebody might use, because they'll say, "Oh, Charlie said that." Well, I can tell that's the sort of thing he would say. And then I suppose that the second most important part of the process are the observations. So going in and observing the board, the committees, seeing how the board works as a team, or how it doesn't work as a team. What's the chair like? How does he or she facilitate the meeting? Do they let people speak first, or do they tend to dominate? Are there any members of the board that dominate? What's the relationship like between the chair and the CEO? Is it working effectively, and the other board members as well? Is the board prioritising? So is it dealing with important matters first, or as I've seen boards where strategy appears as item number 12 on the agenda? So that it's a really critical part of the review, and it's a relatively new one. I mean, a few years ago, boards wouldn't let people in to do observations, but that's very much changed. We'd also do a desktop review of the papers coming to the board, and again, that's not looking at it from a technical perspective, but is the board prioritising its papers? Are the papers too long? Which certainly in financial services, for example, they tend to be. Are they, let's say, prioritising the right things again? Is the paper telling the non-execs, what they need to know? Is it being clear what's being asked from the paper? And then we would look at perhaps doing a peer group comparison, the company against a number of other organisations, and then producing a report. And the report is very practical. So what we're really doing, whilst we'll back up everything that we found, and it will be substantive in that sense, it's really the first 3, 4 or 4 pages that are absolutely key. How effective we find the board to be, and recommendations for enhancement. We can use psychometrics, and Martin is an expert there. I'm not, but he's got a lot of experience there, and that's something that was used early on in board reviews and is coming back. We might look at other things like the relationship between the board and the executive committee. That's always that often comes up in board reviews. How's that working? Over the last 12 months, a lot of focus on environmental, social and governance. A number of you may remember about 15 years ago when there was a big focus on corporate social responsibility, but that tended to die after the last financial crisis. Hopefully that won't happen with ESG, but all sorts of companies are really focusing on that, and that comes to the next point, looking at stakeholders. It's not just taking shareholders into account anymore, it's actually looking at your wider stakeholder group, and diversity and inclusion. There's quite rightly a big focus on that, and looking at diversity in the widest sense of the word, cognitive diversity. So gender, ethnicity, social background, all those disability, all those sort of things being taken into account as well. We'll put the final point: how do you measure? It's quite challenging to measure how effective your board effectiveness review is, and how do you measure how effective the board is, other than going through this process. But I think partly doing the peer group analysis helps that. If we can have the next slide, please. We were asked to look at effective meetings, so just to sort of come on to this. But the first point, the critical role of the chair, I think people really underestimate how difficult it is to chair meetings, and when you see a really effective chair, I mean, it does make such a difference. I sat on a board myself where we'd had a couple of chairs who weren't great, and then we had somebody who was absolutely brilliant. It really made a difference, not just to the dynamics of the board, but actually to the culture of the board and the organisation. So I think, I think it really is a very important role. And in fact, the board effectiveness guidance, which is published by the Financial Reporting Council, again, that's accompanies the UK Corporate Governance Code, says the chair is pivotal in creating the conditions for overall board and individual director effectiveness, setting clear expectations concerning the style and tone of board discussions, ensuring the board has effective decision-making processes and applies sufficient challenge to major proposals. It is up to the chair to make certain that all directors are aware of their responsibilities and hold meetings with the non-executive directors without the executive's presence in order to facilitate a full and frank airing of views. Worth looking at the guidance on board effectiveness, which you can get off the FRC website. It's a free document, but it's very good. So certainly in reviews, we will ask what people think of the chair. We'll very much look at their role in the observations. For me, a really effective chair is a facilitator first. That's the absolutely key thing to do. Company secretary also very important, needs to have if you have one, often it obviously can be somebody else doing that role, but needs close working with the chair. Active listening, again, I think this is underestimated how important listening is. One of my favorite writers is Peter Drucker, who used to say the effective manager listens first and speaks last. And I certainly wish some of the boards I looked at took that mantle on. I think it's been better during COVID and virtual meetings. People have been, I think, better behaved on that. People putting their hands up, or waiting for other people before they come in. And again, it's key to ensure that no domination by one individual. We talked about boardroom dynamics, which is obviously absolutely key to effective meetings. We mentioned the words courage and integrity there. I always say that to non-executive directors, and directors generally, it doesn't have to be non-executives. If there are two things you need as a director to be effective, it's courage and integrity. I think nearly every board I've reviewed, hopefully, I would say everybody around the board has integrity. Courage is a much more wanting aspect. I think boards often don't have courage, and individual directors don't have courage. It's quite, again, rare to see really effective challenge that comes on to the next point. And you shouldn't go onto board expecting it necessarily to be a comfortable place, as some of the previous guidance has said. So you might be in a minority of one, and you've got to be prepared to take that mantle on. Prioritization, just again what we mentioned, I've seen some really effective board meetings where the minutes are actually dealt with last. They're not dealt with first. You deal with the chunky things first. And then I think finally, making sure that your board is making decisions. If you spot, for example, the same things are coming up time and time again, then it probably isn't an effective board. Could we have the next slide, please? Just to, I know we're a little bit short for time, so I won't labour on this too much. So how will the board work in the virtual world? I think we are going to obviously move to a mix and match of more virtual meetings. For example, the committees may meet more often by, if you have committees, by Zoom or Teams rather than having actual meetings. Ad hoc matters may be dealt with more by that, but there's definitely a wish for directors to return to the boardroom. Certainly when I'm sort of pitching to do reviews, yeah, we definitely want to get back together. We really feel it's important to do that. I think there's some challenges for doing virtual meetings, and I'll put some of them down there. You know, not having body language and not being able to see body language so well, that does affect the message. I think the message, they say the words are about 11% of any message. So if you can't see people, you know, together, I think that does make it much more difficult. Equally, when I've done reviews, it's much easier to see if people are actually trying to do something else, because you can see if they're on their emails or doing things. So I guess from a board reviewer's perspective, there have been some advantages. I think also, you know, one things that comes up a lot in board reviews is how visible is the board to employees. And again, it's often a recommendation we make about, you know, the board does need to, the non-executives need to get around to see employees much more, and not just on formal lunches and things like that, which really is a bit of an artificial environment. If we do more meetings virtually, then that's going to make that difficult. Bit of a challenge, obviously, for offshore companies, because you know, you've got to ensure that you are meeting offshore, and so that may impact on you know, with virtual meetings. Some concerns, I suspect, from regulators there. Yeah, people not ADHD, people not actually focusing and doing other things, multitasking, I've said. I think it's also very difficult in terms of building out relationships, particularly if you're new to the board and you haven't met any of the other, your fellow directors. Again, a common thing from board effectiveness reviews that non-executives say is we don't know each other well enough. And this was pre-COVID. You know, we really would like to get to know each other better, because we think the board will work more effectively. And of course, that's even more adverse during the time when you're having to have just virtual meetings. I put warm-up meetings. Again, if you're going to have a virtual meetings, you need to make sure they start well in advance, because one of the things I notice when you're observing boards and committees is the warm-up before the meeting actually starts is really important. Just people just saying, you know, how are you? You know, what have you been up to? If you just start a virtual meeting on 9 o'clock, you don't get that. So that sort of pre-meeting banter. And it's, I think, quite difficult for the company secretary for virtual meetings. They can't be in charge of the technology. They've got too much to run. So if directors are being cut off because their internet doesn't work, then you really need somebody from IT on hand to make sure that everything is running to order. I'm going to go to the next poll if we can, Donasian.
Thank you, Ian.
So next one is what are the most important priorities you think boards face right now? And then I'm going to hand over to Martin to carry on. If we can start to bring
Nearly
that. Yeah, great.
Five more seconds on the poll, and then maybe if we draw it to a close. Great. Should we draw that to a close? Donasian, thank you.
Okay, great. So thank you, Ian. I'll pick up from there. Interesting set of data here from that recent poll. What's fascinating for me is that the first option would obviously not have been there a year ago. I wonder how the answers might have been different then. And I think for me, what we have at the moment, and I think this quick poll maybe bears out my point, we've got a set of underlying and very interesting issues going on, which are overlaid by our current circumstances of the pandemic, which in many ways sort of exacerbate and focus, I think, not just what board members are thinking, but employees and other people in society as well on issues that perhaps were there, but maybe they were less mindful of before. So I'm going to try and draw out some themes here about what those bigger influences might be. I saw something pop up on the chat earlier about investors. I'll deal with them. Really interesting point. But I think just standing back from what's going on in the world at the moment. I've chosen to draw out just a few drivers of change here. I'm always nervous, coming back to Charlie's introduction, when I'm introduced as an expert, because I think actually the expertise is probably on this call today, and we've all got different perspectives and so on. So what I'd like to do is just introduce some things from my point of view, my experience. I'm not saying this is the universe of everything, but I think the things for me that are really important. I've started with diversity. We know that diverse organizations outperform their less inclusive rivals. We know that by up to 50, 60%, some people say. We know that's true. And yet we know as well that the journey that we're going on in diversity is one that we've still only taken the fewest steps on. Ian touched on it earlier. We're not just talking about diversity of representation in terms of gender or ethnicity. We're talking about diversity of thought, and it's a huge and sort of screaming priority across society at the moment. We've got the ever-present changing world of technology. I was reading the other day about something I'd never even thought about, the impact of international translators on the way in which organizations are going to have to change and the way we're going to do business. And we're still grappling with the impact of artificial intelligence and the influence of big data and the ever-present need to be cyber secure and so on. So it doesn't matter, you can't take your eye off the technological ball at all. There's always going to be some new technological challenge that's going to be facing us. And then there's major societal changes going on. When I was younger, people talked about time bombs and demographic time bombs, and I think those time bombs are now sort of beginning to explode in our reality. We've got this huge shift towards urban retrenchment, partly as a result of people's aspirations changing, and partly again as a result of the pandemic. I was struck the other day. I was reading that 25% of the population of Europe are already over 65. A massive shift in the needs of potential customers and so on, with an ever-present demand for speed, access to services, access to products. So all of those pace issues aren't going away. And then we've got some massive workforce patterns that are emerging as well at the moment. We've got the challenge that was emerging prior to the pandemic between the sort of the contingent and permanent workforce, the gig economy. What does employment really mean? All of those threads, but particularly now we've got people facing into the changing purpose of the office, organizations facing into those decisions about, where are we based? Are we based? What's our policy? All of those things, and an increasing demand from employees for agile working and for their voice to be heard. So that's just a quick set of some drivers. So Darcy, next slide, if you would, please. Then we've got some wider accountability changes. Yes, that point about investors. If you hadn't heard of Reddit and Wall Street Bets a few months ago, you'd be amazed now, wouldn't you, about how they can move stock prices internationally just by some recommendations. And of course, we've got institutional investors, the likes of Vanguard and BlackRock, making big demands of their organizations about their policies on climate change, diversity, or you won't be part of our fund. hedge funds, religious organisations actually changing members of the makeup of boards who are aligned with their values and so on. So yes, real pressure from investors, pressure from employees, that increasing voice of employees that people are now having to listen to. We're seeing that surface in big organisations like Alphabet and Amazon, where boards are being forced to consider resolutions put by employees. I was reading the other day about Amazon having to make file some resolutions on climate change and on ethnicity and diversity as a result of 5,000 staff writing to Jeff Bezos and demanding it. And there's growing evidence that employees feel it's okay to speak out and have their voice heard. And then we've also got the ever-present and ever-changing dynamic of the world being forced upon us by politicians and regulators. Just in the UK, of course, we've got the corporate transparency and register reform as an example of that. The move to ever-increasing move to put responsibilities on board members to, in this example, be more transparent and to think about banning of directors and so on. So almost like the tenor of a mini sort of Sarbanes-Oxley kind of style movement in the marketplace, increasing accountability in that space. And the media, social media, I read a fascinating Forbes article a few weeks ago entitled "Your Board Members' Social Media Skills Can Increase Your Organization's Power." And whether we like it or not, that whole world of transparency of decisions, permanence of our digital footprint, being part of media and social media is not an option for board members. It's no good to be a Luddite. You've got to be present and nimble and agile in that whole space. And you might or might not be interested to know that since I started this sentence, 6,000 tweets have just been sent. That's the world in which we live. 6,000 tweets a second are going on out there, and we need to be at the vanguard of that and present in it and active in it and aware that what we do is transparent. So it's no good being a bystander on it, and it's no good being a bystander on ESG. Ian touched on that, but it's no good just being aware. It's no good saying it's important. I think increasingly boards need to be thought leaders in that whole space. Sustainability is a prerequisite. Social justice is prominent right across every news channel you turn on. These days that there's some big message about social justice, and of course, you don't have to turn very far to consider the importance of prominence and behaviour of senior figures in public life. It's very, very real for people in society at the moment. So there's sort of quick whistle-stop tour on some accountability changes, and then next slide, if you would, Donatien, please. Just looking specifically at the pandemic, as our poll said, overlaid on top of that. What's fascinating for me is that the pandemic, it's very easy to think of it as something that's caused a narrow set of common responses. Well, it hasn't. Depending on whether you're Generation X, Generation Y, or from millennials. And by the way, we all need to know the difference between those. We all have different responses. 15% of the over 55s are thinking about retiring now. Whereas 87% of under 25s are reevaluating why they're at work at all and whether they want to change career. And 60% of people are saying they're thinking now of a job change, retraining. I mean, it's an incredible sort of change, this punctuation that has been brought upon us all, that's caused people to think differently about things. And Ian's touched on stakeholder engagement. It's different now. We've become to appreciate an online world. It's not easy. It's not just the job of investor relations anymore. And how do you do it anyway? And it requires different approaches and different skills, and not just the traditional set. So a real kind of practical shift in the way in which we relate to each other. And there's an ever increasing expectation that organizations, boards, leaders have got well-being at the top of their agenda. And well-being is such an interesting area because it's, in my experience, it's an area where, for good reason, we don't have many of the answers. We're facing into things that hitherto have been pretty unknown to us. And people would have said, I don't know anything about that. A number of times I've been talking to people saying, I'm being asked, what's our policy on, or what's our approach on? And I just don't know. But there is an increased expectation that we're all mindful of mental health. We're all thinking about the impacts of furlough and redundancy on people's well-being, and organizations are supporting hybrid working, return to work, and so on. Some really interesting work I was reading about the other day on return anxiety, a very real phenomenon. And unless we are aware of these kind of issues, we're not going to bring the thought leadership we need to senior levels in organisations. And finally, of course, risk planning. Prior to the pandemic, a recent survey showed that 82% of organisations didn't have pandemics in their top 10 risk. But interestingly now, another 80% post the pandemic say it's completely changed their thinking. And of course, it has a whole different approach to incident management, risk planning, thinking about how we might deploy resources differently, workforce planning, the future of work, a whole new range of different challenges for us. So a quick set of thoughts there. Just moving on, if we would, Darcy, next slide. So what does that mean for us? Well, it means, I think, that we've got to think about the competence of board members in terms of what they know about. So we need people to be tech savvy, as I've touched on, understanding what it means to have a digital presence, being able to talk fluently about impact of artificial intelligence, robotics, data analytics, blockchain. We've got to know about these things. We've got to know about sustainability and climate change. We've got to understand it. It's not just about being aware of what it is. Innovation. We've got to be open to new things, coming from directions that we'd never even thought of. We've got to be able to focus on leading indicators, not just lagging indicators, and develop, I think, a greater opportunity focus than has been traditional for board members, less of a risk focus, but at the same time maintaining a risk focus. So that whole mindset of being open to opportunity. But the risk perspective, I think, has to be there. It probably arguably now just has to be broadened to consider broader, wider issues of trade, tax, now even public health, politics, power. It's not just a narrower interpretation. And other thoughts about competence. So next slide, if you would, Jonathan, please. The final thoughts I've got here are taken from a third-party survey from board members, and they were asked what they thought the competencies of the future would have to shift towards, and they talked about greater emotional intelligence, that whole theme that Ian touched on about how we relate to each other, interpersonal skills and so on. Really interesting one, focusing on the need for board members to develop a moral compass, to be able to make those decisions on the basis of all of these sort of wide-scale influences and changes to which I've referred. The need for curiosity, not just to take things on face value or to think about things in the way we might have done in the past, but to really wonder about, I wonder why that's going on, what's happening here. Critical thinking, I think, has always been valued, but in my experience, it's often been a more sort of narrow deductive thinking that has been valued at board level, rather than that ability to really consider these wider issues. I think there's a whole challenge for the way in which people think. Adaptable personalities, being prepared to change, recognizing that today will not be the same as tomorrow, plus or minus 5%. It really will not. Greater tolerance of ambiguity, a willingness to make decisions when we really don't know. And just practically as well, I smiled when I saw this one, just an awareness that those demands are going to increase. So we need people who are prepared to work harder and harder in order to fulfill their responsibilities. And then just finally, before we take another poll, just some thoughts here about implications of on board diversity. So final slide, if you would, Jonathan, thanks. I think we need to have greater diversity of representation. It's screaming at us, and yet, despite the Parker report a few years ago, almost a fifth of FTSE 100 companies still lack any ethnic minority representation at all. Of 326 AIM UK 50 companies, 97% of their directors are white, and 95% of FTSE small cap 100 directors are white. And I know that's only one dimension of diversity, but it's a screaming set of statistics. We've got to shift the dial on diversity of thought. we've got to see a trend towards more fresh air in boards, I think. We've got to see renewal, we've got to see rotation, we've got to see shorter contracts. I see some organizations bringing in some interesting dynamics around performance-related contracts and so on, shorter tenure, certainly not jobs for life. We really do need to see a change there. And we are seeing beginning of the introduction of niche players to bringing in some of that expertise to which I referred. A recent example from Berkeley Holmes, they've appointed an ex-editor of the Evening Standard on their board just to bring in a particular perspective and so on. So we've got to shift the dial on diversity. It's moving in the right direction, but I think it's moving far too slowly. So I'm going to stop there and just go to our final poll, please, and then we'll broaden out for a bit of a discussion. So final poll. So what are the most critical competencies that you think make up an effective board? So just 4 to choose from: diversity of representation, strategic awareness, ability to challenge, and cohesiveness. Just give you a few moments to think about that. And then I'll hand back to Ian. So, okay, is that long enough for everyone? Okay, so let's close that and see what people are thinking. All right, ability to challenge, interesting. Okay, yeah, really interesting. I would, if we had longer, I would love a discussion about what we mean by challenge. Some fascinating data on this traditional view of impact. I know somebody sent in a question before this session about what do we mean by impact. And I think all the research says that the ability to challenge is all about competence, relevance, and being liked. Those 3 factors, they're fairly primeval to us in our ability to relate to other people, and that's not about being the loudest voice in the room, as Ian suggested earlier, either. So some interesting thoughts there. Anyway, over to Ian as we move to the end of this. So Ian, back to you.
Thank you, Martin. I mean, it's interesting. I very much agree with the challenge point, and I think one of the problems with challenging, or people find with challenging, it is the likability perspective, and I think we think that conflict around the boardroom table is that. And conflict and tension is a bad thing, but actually conflict and tension can also be a positive factor in a boardroom, certainly not to ensure there isn't groupthink. And the likability, yes, I remember a very famous American business writer saying, if you want to be liked by a dog, I hedged, I bought 2. Actually, you're not on the board to be liked. You're on the board to make some difficult calls, particularly as a non-executive director. And that is, an uncomfortable place often. Let's just turn very briefly to succession planning, because I know there were some questions that have been asked on chat. There may be others. I mean, the first point is obviously it is paramount. Of course, now, particularly with listed and regulated companies, you've got a finite life as a non-executive director, however good you may be. However effective you may be, because there's generally 9 years is your time limit. So boards are going to have to focus on this, but you also have to think about unexpected changes to the board. There's a code in the financial services sector, a supervisory statement published by the Bank of England, which says you must cater for sudden departures, and I've certainly come across boards where people have had to go for all sorts of reasons unexpectedly, and sometimes it's been the chair. So you do really need to focus on this. So don't underestimate the challenge. It's often the focus of the nomination committee, and that's absolutely fine. But the board has to own succession planning, because the board is responsible for who it appoints. So you can't just leave it to the nomination committee. It's important that it is the board as a whole. The role of the HRD can be very important in supporting this, making sure you get the right person on the team. So and again, I'll just going to the final point, because I know we're running out of time. Good inductions, really important. And certainly when we do board reviews, one of the things we notice is that it's actually not a question of just being sent lots of material, but it's actually meeting people within the organisation and building those relationships and making sure that that's ongoing. I think I'm going to leave it there, because I know there are some questions and that we've had on chat, and there may be some other questions too. Is it worth dealing with the questions we've had on the chat first?
If I just take some ownership of the Q&A bit. So thanks very much, Ian, and thanks very much, Martin. So I see some questions in the chat, and we've had some early questions, but just in terms of real time, is there anyone out there who'd like to air their question first and foremost? Perhaps if you're able to take yourself off mute and ask a question, I'll put that opportunity out there first.
Charlie, it's Ian. I mean, maybe I'll just pick up on the question that I asked early on about shareholder activism. It's interesting, everything that's been said presents some very tough challenges, I think, for boards going forward. Makes governance very difficult. In fact, I do wonder whether it's an enjoyable job or not being a director these days. But from personal experience, however good a board can be in terms of its governance, and however good it is at meeting all of the challenges that have just been set out, you can have shareholders, particularly in private equity backed businesses and maybe smaller quoted businesses, that just, if they choose to, can drive a coach and horses through the good governance that the boards are trying to put in place. I just wonder whether that shareholder activism trend is becoming a bigger concern for non-execs and for boards generally.
Please do. Yeah, thank you. Ian. From one Ian to another Ian.
Thank you. I think it is. I think motive is really key, isn't it? That, I mean, there will be occasions where a major shareholder, institutional shareholder, has concerns about the direction or the performance of the company, and that can, be of a help if they are genuinely trying, to improve the performance of the company, improve the effectiveness of the board. If alternatively they're just a short-term holder and they're trying to disrupt things, then I think it can be very damaging. I suppose I'm bound to say, though, if you've got shareholders, you have to expect that they've got a right to try and influence things if they can. They're the owners of the company. But I agree, it does make being a non-exec or being a director generally quite challenging.
Hi, Charlie, if I may add to that, Ian White, I think your point on motive is very relevant, and I think the shareholder structure plays a large role in that. And what we're seeing and what we're hearing through forums and webinars like this is that there may, over the next couple of years, as boards are dealing with the governance challenges that are coming out and have become very prevalent during the pandemic, that PE are able to be more nimble. Their focus on EBIT and revenue and growth probably allows them to be a bit more nimble than listed businesses, which of course has an impact on the role, on the role of the non-exec and what they're obliged to do and report on.
Agreed.
Thank you for that, Layla. Has anyone else got a question they'd like to propose?
I've got a question, Charlie. It's regarding the whole DE&I topic, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's a big challenge. I think we all face. We know we need to face it, and I guess the question is how to balance that need with. I think one of the panelists was talking about the voice of the employee. It's particularly with the younger, employees, they're becoming very, very vocal, very active in many areas, and I think that's good. I think engaging with them is important. You need, I think happy, motivated people lead to successful business, but striking that balance between the employee and board and trying to put that together is very difficult. So any thoughts on how you try and make sure you're listening to the employee, but at the same time as a board going, we're running the business, we need to stick to our knitting of what we're doing day to day, where we're trying to go as a business.
Thanks for that, Jonathan. Martin, are you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure Ian's got some thoughts as well, but I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Jonathan. I totally agree. There's a tension here. I think the reality is that across society is that increasingly, not just employees, I agree with you, customers as well are saying, you know, if you don't look like me, if you don't sound like me, if you don't talk like me, then I'm not necessarily going to buy from you. I mean, I think it's such a big commercial issue as well, that I think the answer lies in people facing into it and addressing it and having it at the top of their priority list and making some proactive changes. The most successful organizations I've seen who've made moves in this have taken some risks with some of the appointments they've made. They broadened the representation on their boards. You know, they brought in, the example we briefly gave, specific individuals with specific expertise and niche, and they've gone to the marketplace with a particular remit to look for somebody who may not be in the traditional NED space, but could add X, Y, or Z, and so on. So they've changed the parameters of their search and so on. And I think the first thing that would drive that is actually really being aware of its importance and then taking that proactive action. And I think we've just got a lot more to do. But even, you know, in its own way, conversations like this, just realizing that it's screamingly important and realizing that we're a long way away is really, really valuable. But I'm sure Ian's got some thoughts as well on that.
Yeah, I mean, I often wish that boards would, particularly non-execs, would get to know employees better and really walk around the office. I mean, there's been quite a lot done recently in the last 2 or 3 years on having for the listed sector, having workforce advisory groups and NEDs sitting on those and getting more exposure to employees that way. But a lot of this is quite formal. The amount of times I've done board reviews and I've done an observation of a meeting and the meeting comes to an end and the non-exec saying, right, must rush for my train, got to get back. Rather than thinking, actually, I'll go and walk around the office, I'll go and soak up a bit of culture. I worked in retail for a time, and I remember saying to my non-execs, you know, make sure you go around the stores, you know, don't just go visit them and go around head office, walk around head office, you know, sort of management by walking around. So I think the first thing is it's really focusing that way. Very few boards have adopted the principle of appointing employees to the board as non-execs. I think there are 2 or 3 in the FTSE 350. So I don't think that's going to take on very much. I think the other thing is customer, and we mentioned the word customer. The amount of times I've done reviews where you interview the non-execs and they say, we really don't understand the customer, we don't really know exactly who the customer is, and it's an amazing statement, but they you know, that often comes up. And of course your customer can be a number of different organizations and people, so you know, I can understand it sometimes takes time to get to know the customer, but again I think there needs to be more focus on that.
Charlie,
I would
sorry.
add to.
I was just going to say, if I may just add a couple of things. Sorry, for those who don't know me, I'm Layla. I'm a managing director and colleague of Charlie's on behalf exec. Through a series again of webinars and discussions that we've been doing with businesses, I think there are 2 messages I would share that we're hearing consistently from a PR angle, being authentic. So Jonathan, your point earlier about, you know, employees, and we've talked about customer disconnect, having a voice, a corporate voice that's authentic is important and something to think about. So if you weren't thinking or talking about diversity and inclusion before, suddenly jumping on the bandwagon and not taking any action can, you know, the transparency is there, particularly in social media. So being authentic. And secondly, the employee engagement. We had Glint speaking last week on a webinar. So Glint is part of LinkedIn. It's an employee survey, employee engagement survey for those that don't know it. They had a number of interesting statistics. Understandably, employee engagement surveys have increased, but through tools and technology such as Your Flock, which is a communication and culture tool, Glint surveys, keeping in touch and asking employees, but in a structured and managed way through HR, to then translate that into policy for hybrid working models. It's a transition that everybody's going through, and I think our sense is there's no right or wrong answer. It's a transitionary process that, as long as boards are considering and communicating that they are considering, will reassure employees and keep them connected. One last statistic I'll just share with you that we heard also from Glint last week. They revealed a study and on a survey that they've done, showing that 90% of employees are companies that were enforcing and keen on returning to the office. So this was done about 4 weeks ago, were led by predominantly male boards with an age demographic of 50 plus.
Thank you. I think, thank you for that, Layla. A really good insight. I think we've probably got time for one more question. I know there are a lot of questions in the chat, and we've had some previous. Please be reassured, we will answer all those questions after the event through follow up. But anybody got time for one more question that they'd like to ask? Nope. Perhaps we might come to one of the ones on the that was sent to us.
Well, Charlie, sorry to interrupt Ian again, but I just wonder then, if there is a final chance for a final question, do you think all of this is going to change non-executive director pay? Do you think remuneration is going to have to change because of the challenges of boards? I mean, what's, given your obvious insights as a executive search company, what are you seeing on that front?
Yeah, thank you. I think that's an interesting question. I think we see increased time and increased demand for a much broader set of skills coming into that non-exec role at the moment. I think pay is one of the things that does lag behind. It's not always the reason why people do it. You know, I have to be honest. A lot of the reasons people do it is because, you know, they want to be putting something back in. They want to be moving their career into a different phase of its journey, and therefore, you know, pay is not a core motivator. But I do think there will have to be a trade-off and a balance. You know, we can't be expecting people to do the same hours for the same reward that they might have been looking at 5 or 6 years ago. You know, they're going to be doing more hours for the same reward. Sorry, that needs to be looked at. But it's not the only motivator, I think, for people who take on those roles. So I think that would be my answer to that.
And I think if I can add just to that, I mean, I think if you're doing a non-executive role, you definitely shouldn't be doing it for the money alone. I mean, you should be able to walk away, you know, from it. I think, you know, I still question whether we've got the non-executive role right. What do we really want from our non-execs? You know, what sorts of involvement? You know, I always struggle with it, really, whether we really need to redefine the role. And you're right, you know, I think what Charlie says is right. I think it's definitely, particularly in heavily regulated sectors, the time commitment has really gone up, and will increasingly. I can't see it reducing.
Okay. Well, thank you, Ian. Thank you, Martin, and thank you everybody for your attention and contribution today. I think it's been a great session. There's been lots of insight, lots of food for thought, and lots of big questions that we need to keep working through. So we will respond to those questions that have been posted in the chat and previous questions, and we will summarise the takings from today and send that across to you throughout the next week. So I really appreciate your time. Everyone stay safe, everyone have a good day, and look forward to picking up with you as we progress through the reduced lockdown situation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Charlie.
Really
Charlie, thanks.